Ken here to discuss results as they come in and the impact on Catholic communities is Ken Craycraft. Ken is a professor of moral theology at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Cincinnati. He is also the author of the book Citizens Yet Strangers, Living Authentically Catholic in a Divided America. Ken, great to have you here in studio.
Good to be here, Tracy. Thank you.
I know, you once wrote that the 2020 election was the most deeply partisan election. Where do you think this one ranks?
I think it's even more partisan, and I think that there's a partisanship here that makes it unique, even distinct from the last one, and that is because people really don't feel like they have a vote in this election in many ways. So it is hyper-partisan from the people who are very partisan, but people who don't really put as much stock in politics as others, they feel like they don't have a place to go in this election in many cases. So the decision in this election is sometimes less between the two candidates than between whether I can vote for this candidate who I would usually otherwise vote for or not. And so it's more partisan, I think, even than it was in 2020, but the partisanship is manifesting itself in a different way. And the way that it's manifesting itself shows us what I think is a broader problem in American culture and American political life, and that is that we put so much emphasis on politics, such that politics almost becomes our God. And when that God fails, then we don't know where to turn. And I think that the partisanship that we see in this election is certainly left over from 2020, strong commitments from some voting blocs to a particular party. But I think in this election, we're also seeing people who simply don't feel like they have a place to go because of the problems with both candidates. And I think that really is more of a dividing line in this election than it has been in prior elections.
Yeah, and that's sort of a jumping off point for me here. I want to talk about the election as Catholics,
yeah.
And the choices that we had to make.
I've told my students that if Catholics voted as a bloc, we would be a very significant party in the U.S. But of course, we don't vote as a bloc. There's no voting bloc. And what I see in large part is the way that Catholics vote is it has less to do with their public policy positions and the candidates that support those positions being informed by Catholic faith than being informed by the same kind of partisanship that we've talked about before. And for Catholics, I think this is something of an acid test for how we understand our place in American politics, because we feel like we must be constrained by the two choices that the two major parties have given us, and for many Catholics that's just a false choice. And I think that, and for Catholics for whom it's not a false choice, but who fall very clearly on one side or the other, considering the issues and the candidates in this election, I view that as something of a problem, because I view that as something of Catholics not really informing their votes and their public policy positions by their faith, but rather by their political commitments, their partisan commitments. And I see that as a problem, but I see also see this election as an opportunity for Catholics to rethink the way that we orient ourselves toward politics, such that partisanship and politics in general should have less of a role in our lives, so that we have more time in our lives for those things that are more conducive to notions of socialization and community, and the types of things that are part of what it means to have participate in public life, but are not necessarily political in nature. Because in this election, many Catholics don't feel like they have a political choice.
Yeah, and it's not just between two candidates. I mean, there's a lot of things that people are voting on, including ballot measures. And one I want to talk about in Florida, there was a measure that would allow adults to legally possess up to 3 ounces of marijuana. I believe that failed. Also in Massachusetts, there was a ballot measure that would allow the use of certain plant-based psychedelics. What does this say about where we are as a society with these types of ballot measures?
I think that they reflect a basic spiritual ennui in American public life. That because we have lost a sense of transcendence, because the more we become secularized, we have to have, or we look for something to replace that loss of transcendence. Generally we think of transcendence as worship of God or worship of something of whatever religious faith we believe in. But as we move away from that, as society becomes more secular and less devoted to traditional senses or sources of transcendent fulfillment, we look forward in other ways. And these ballot measures are a perfect example of that. And I think that, again, that spiritual ennui is really on display when we see ballot measures like this, where we try to replace something that is missing in our lives. And of course, what we try to replace it with in these cases are just intoxicants, which don't solve any problem and don't fulfill that longing that we have, that we've lost as we've become more secular and less attuned to authentic transcendence.
Yeah, we're almost out of time here, but what role does our faith play in helping us trust the election process? There was a recent study, I believe it was Arizona Christian University, and they found about half of Christians who said they weren't going to vote. They weren't going to do it because they felt the election was already rigged.
I don't know how to answer a question about how people thinking it's already rigged, but I will say this: as Catholics, one of the things that this election tells us, including people who think that it's rigged, is that we don't put our trust in princes, to quote the psalmist. We put our trust in God. You know, at the end of this month, we're going to celebrate the Feast of Christ the King. That should be more important to us than Tuesday, November 5th. And if that becomes more important to us as Catholic Christians, we're going to have a major impact on American public life that we don't have now, because we haven't focused on Christ as King. Rather, we often focus on politics as King, and politics is a false god. And when our idols fail, then we don't know where to turn. And of course, as Catholics, we know that our new year begins in that eschatological vision of the Feast of Christ the King at the end of this month. That should be a bigger day for us Catholics than Election Day.
Absolutely, Ken. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. We'll talk to you a little bit later on in the show.